This is Chapter 41, Part 2, Community Ecology. These are student learning objectives that we discussed in the previous lecture. Okay, so the first part we're going to talk about is called ecological succession. Species often alter the habitat in ways that allow other species to replace them, and this is called ecological succession. Here, for example, you see that a fire occurred, and the year after fire, there's nothing really there left. Think about like the wildflowers in California. However, over time, different plants and animals are going to take over the land, and this is going to lead to ecological succession. So we're going to be discussing the steps of ecological succession today. Pioneer species are the first opportunistic colonizers of a new or newly vacated habitat. So think about it like humans as pioneers. When we pioneer an area, it's a place that no one's ever been before. So pioneer species have a high dispersal rate and grow and mature fast and produce many offspring. They're usually going to be pretty small plants. I like to think of them as weeds or dandelions. So pioneer species are species that can colonize a new habitat. And these include things like mosses, lichen, and some flowering annuals like dandelions. Primary succession occurs or begins when a pioneer species colonizes a barren habitat with no soil, such as a new volcanic island or land exposed by the retreat of a glacier. So if a glacier moves and all of a sudden all there is rock. Pioneers help build and improve the soil because what happens is they're going to land and they're going to start to put roots in the cracks and crevices of these rocks. And once they die, that's going to lead to soil for other plants to then grow on. So primary succession is a new community becomes established in an area where there has been absolutely no soil, no other organisms living there. So think barren rock, like new lava or a barren rock face where a glacier has retreated. Seeds of later species are then going to grow in the mats of pioneers, and organic waste and remains are going to accumulate and help other species take hold. And then later successional species often shade and eventually displace the earlier ones. So you can see here we have our pioneer species, these grasses, these weeds, these annuals. And then over time they're going to die and leave organic matter or soil for other species to then come in and take over. Here we have the intermediate stages where we have like shrubs and bushes. And then eventually we have a climax community where you can see like big trees. And what's going to happen is they're going to create shade where these smaller species will no longer be able to get sunlight. So we talked about primary succession, which occurs when there's nothing there before, so on lava or rock. In a secondary succession, what happens is a disturbed area within a community recovers. This occurs a lot in abandoned agriculture fields and burned forest. So a secondary succession is when a new community develops in a site where the soil that supported an old community remains. So for example, right now we see a lot of sugarcane being harvested around town. So if that sugarcane gets harvested and then all of a sudden nothing is planted there, then weird weeds and shrubs and different things are going to start to grow, leading to a secondary succession. Species composition of a community changes frequently and unpredictably. Random events can determine the order in which species arrive and affect the course of succession. For example, in 1980, there was an eruption of a volcano in the United States called Mount St. Helens. The presence of some pioneers helped later arriving plants become established. Other pioneers kept the same and late arrivals out. And this is a fantastic YouTube video that kind of shows you how succession occurred on Mount St. Helens. Now, this is a secondary succession because there was already life growing on this mountain, but unfortunately, after the volcano erupted, all of the fire and heat and smoke killed those organisms. So there are three factors that affect species composition in communities. Physical factors such as soil and climate, a chance event such as the order in which species arrive, and the extent of disturbances in the habitat. So if the habitat is pretty stable, then the community is going to be pretty stable. But if the habitat is not stable, for example, in like flood zones where flooding occurs a lot, then the communities may not be as stable. Long-term change in communities. The array of species in a community changes over time, although the exact outcome of these changes is difficult to predict. When a new community forms, the early arriving species often alter the habitat in a way that facilitates their own replacement. Think about the pocket gopher that you learned about in the previous video. If it didn't survive the Mount St. Helens blast, would plant species be there today? So again, please watch that video that's on Moodle about the Mount St. Helens blast. It's really fascinating, and it's a great way to show secondary succession. Species interactions and community stability. The loss or addition of even one species, called the keystone species, may stabilize the number and abundance of species in a community. So a keystone species is a species that has a disproportionately large effect on the community structure. For example, the purple sea star are important for keeping mollusk populations down. And here's a great video about various keystone populations. So let's talk about this sea star. So the keystone species is this purple sea star. Sea stars prey mainly on mussels, and mussels are like clams. They're bivalves, so they have two shells. And sea stars were removed from an experimental plot in the ocean. With the sea stars gone, the mussels took over, crowding out 7 other species of invertebrate. So once those mussels were no longer controlled by the sea star population, they basically took over, killing 7 other species. So the conclusion is that the sea stars are keystone species. They normally keep the number of prey species like those mussels high by preventing competitive exclusion by the mussels. Another keystone species would be this periwinkle snail. The impact of a keystone species can vary between habitats that differ in the same species array. For example, in tide pools, periwinkles eat the most competitive algae species, allowing less competitive species to survive. But in the lower intertidal zone, periwinkles eat the less competitive algae, giving the dominant algae an advantage. Some species adapted to being disturbed are at a competitive disadvantage if the disturbance does not occur. For example, areas that have periodic fires. Some plants produce seeds that germinate only after a fire and resprout quickly after a fire. Because different species respond differently to fire, the frequency of fire affects the competitive interactions. For example, jack pines. If you watch this video about jack pines, basically jack pines need the heat from the fire to allow the seeds to open up and sprout. Another type of species is the indicator species. Indicator species are the first to do poorly when conditions change, so they can provide early warning signs of environmental degradation. Examples would be trout. Trout are highly sensitive to pollutants and cannot tolerate low oxygen levels. So if the water that they're living in starts to become really polluted, then you'll no longer see trout populations. So indicator species are species that is essentially sensitive to disturbances and can be monitored to assess the health of a habitat. Have you ever heard about a canary in a coal mine? Coal miners used to bring canaries down to the coal mine because if the canary, which is very sensitive to changes in gases in the air, died, then the coal miners knew it was time to get out. Other species are called exotic species. Exotic species can dramatically alter a natural community. More than 4,500 exotic species have become established in the United States, and you can actually see what some of these exotic species are by visiting this website. Exotic species are species that evolved in one community and later became established in a different one. There are a lot of different exotic species in Louisiana, and actually Science Distilled this Thursday is going to be going over some of those in greater detail. One example are these apple snails. Now, if you ever drive down the bayou, you might see these pink egg sacs and wonder what they are. Apple snails were introduced when people started dumping their fish tanks into the bayou, and they're called apple snails because the snails can get as large as apples. They have a very voracious appetite. They're herbivores, which means they eat plants, and they're feared that they will eventually get to the rice paddies in Louisiana and eat the rice paddies dry. Other exotic species include kudzu, which is native to Asia, is overgrowing trees across the southeastern United States. If you drive along highways, you might see them taking over. The gypsy moth, which is native to Europe and Asia, feed on oaks through much of the United States. And I'm sure we're all familiar with nutria, which are native to South America and are abundant in freshwater marshes in the Gulf states. Key concepts. Species that affect our community. Removing species from a community or adding one to it can have a dramatic effect on other species. What are the various types of succession? What are factors that can influence succession? And in some species are adapted to disturbances and change in the frequency of disturbances can affect their number. What is a keystone species, an indicator species, and exotic species? Biogeographic patterns in a community structure. Biogeography is the study of how species are distributed in the natural world. Species richness correlates with the differences in sunlight, temperature, rainfall, and other factors that vary with latitude, elevation, or water depth. Species richness of an area where the species richness of an area, the number of species. You can see that the middle of the United States and lower has a higher species richness where it's a lot warmer. Species richness is usually greatest in the tropics and declines from the equator to the poles. Tropical latitudes intercept more sunlight, receive more rainfall, and their growing season is longer. So that's why you see a greater species difference along the equator. Tropical communities have been evolving for a long time, and species richness may be self-reinforcing. More plant species leads to more herbivores, which leads to more predators, which leads to more parasites. So it's kind of like the more plants there are and the different types, then the more animals that will be there because they are supported. So global patterns in community structure. Biogeographers identify regional patterns in species distribution, and they've shown that tropical regions hold the greatest number of species. These are your key terms for Chapter 41, and these are the student learning objectives for Chapter 41, which you can make a study guide with.